and gentlemen, on behalf of the Daniel Institute, may I welcome you to this discussion of a topic which is unfortunately highly topical today. The reason is that in yesterday's elections in the state of Ohio in the United States, an amendment to the state constitution was passed, which united, in rather vague language, two issues. One was extending abortion rights, protecting them against legislative restrictions, and the other was protecting the rights of children to receive gender transformation. And I mentioned the wording of the motion of the amendment was vague in a way, and it seems that it protects the rights of children to have abortions and indeed to have gender reassignment surgery. It protects them from parental control or even involvement. Now, this is something that I think 20 or 30 years ago, maybe even 10, would have occasioned amazement and outrage in Western societies like our own. And in a way, among certain groups of people, it still does. And the reason it would have caused outrage is because most of us thought that the acceptance of parental rights in matters such as education, but in medical questions too, the parental rights in controlling their children's education and their children's medical treatment was more or less absolute as a result of being incorporated in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it is indeed there. But in the last 10 years or so, under the impulse of a lot of the theories which are roiling society in general, everything from gender theory to critical race theory, to diversity and its associated virtues in education, and the impact of these various ideas, parental rights have come to be discarded, ignored, overridden. Now, why is this happening? In order to answer that question, we're very fortunate to have Anthony O'Hare, an English professor of philosophy and a philosopher himself, who has a distinguished career, both in academic life and also in what I would call the world of government advice and criticism. He has been asked by governments to take part in some of the institutions that guide and criticize and direct educational policy. I think it's fair to say, I think he may emerge in his remarks, that in doing so, he's often felt himself to be on the losing sides of debates in Whitehall when he should have been on the winning side. And certainly I think a lot of us who follow his writings will think that he should have been on the winning side and find ourselves rather discombobulated by the fact that it's very hard for people to give academic advice to governments that in the end they pay less attention to than they should. As Professor O'Hare has a distinguished academic record. He was also the editor of the magazine Philosophy for many years, the magazine of the Royal Society of Philosophy. And he, at the moment, is a professor of educational policy and philosophy at the University of Buckingham. I could say a lot of other things. I think I misspoke a moment ago. He is also the honorary director of the Royal Institute of Philosophy and editor of its journal. He is a co-founder of the Journal of Applied Philosophy. He has co-authored many books on philosophy and on the arts. The book he co-authored with his daughter on the arts won a major international prize for the best book on the arts in a year when there were a number of distinguished books that were in competition with it. He was a government advisor on education for 10 years, and he was especially influential, I don't think this is entirely coincidental, during the time of Margaret Thatcher and John Major, when he was teaching at Bradford University. I think we're very fortunate to have such a distinguished exponent, defender of human rights, to address us. After he's spoken, I'll be inviting Jeremy Carl, who's a visiting fellow too, here at the Danube Institute, to respond, and then we'll have a brief discussion with the audience, and I look forward to all of this. Professor O'Hare, thank you for coming. I look forward to what you have to say.
Thank you very much. In fact, I was just working out, this is my 8th time in Budapest, but I always enjoy being here, particularly near the castle and that area. Now, what role is there for parents' rights in education? The United Nations Declaration of Human Rights was ratified in 1948. Its Article 26 states in unequivocal terms that, quote, parents have a prior right to choose the kind of education that shall be given to their children. Slightly earlier, in 1944, the British Parliament passed a landmark Education Act, 76 of which stated that pupils are to be educated in accordance with the wishes of their parents. As far as I know, the 1944 Act has not been repealed in this respect, and the United Nations Declaration still holds. The cynic would no doubt say that even in 1948, parents quoting Article 26 in the USSR would have got short shrift. They may well have found their children enmeshed in state schools and nurseries and pioneer palaces, denouncing them to their minders. By the end of the 1950s, parents wishing to invoke Article 26 would have fared no better in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, East Germany, Romania, Albania, and in many other places, including probably China and Cuba. But leaving the situation in the Eastern Bloc before the fall of the Berlin Wall, though, we should note that there are currently in Britain and in other places in the West disturbing signs that parental wishes may be being flouted in ways undreamt of in the 1940s and 50s, as John has just mentioned. It's not just that parents in Britain have extremely limited choice over which schools their children will go to, but more that within schools, doctrines and ideologies which many parents would object to are being promulgated and enforced through state directives and inspectorates. I say would object to here because it is not always easy for parents nowadays to find out exactly what is being taught and advocated in their children's schools on such sensitive and disputed matters as sexuality, race, and climate. This itself says something about the way some of those in charge of education, including some head teachers, view the rights of the parents of their pupils. So, why are parental rights important? The UN Declaration talks about parents having rights over the education of their children. Does this imply that the mere fact of propagating children gives parents something akin to the possession of the children they bring into the world? In my view, children do not belong to their parents, as a car or a house might. Children are living human beings, increasingly with minds of their own, moving towards autonomy and independence, which is part of what a civilized upbringing should be directed towards. Nevertheless, the intimate relationship between parents and their children means that parents are best placed to make certain decisions over the way their children should be reared and educated. And in this sense, parents have rights over and above any we may think belong to the state in this respect. And I could mention that in the encyclical Rerum Novarum of 1891, the Pope of the time said that parents, not the state, have the right to determine the education of their children. And in that, the Pope was following Thomas Aquinas. However, there have been societies in which a very different view of parental rights from the Thomistic one was taken, and there have been distinguished thinkers who have dismissed such rights entirely. We will now look at Sparta and Plato as paradigmatic examples of a society and a thinker in each case. Because what I want to do for the first half of this talk is to establish why I think parental rights are important. So I'm going to contrast Sparta and Plato with Athens and Aristotle in this respect. So we start with Plato. According to Plutarch, in his biography of Lycurgus, the legislator credited with the development of ancient Sparta, Spartan children were held not to belong to their fathers, but to the state in common. They belonged to the state in the sense that boys and men were bred to fight for Sparta, while girls and women were to produce offspring for the purposes of fighting themselves and propagating for the common good. Belonging to the state in common entailed that on birth, a newborn child would be examined by tribal elders. If they were flawed or deformed, they were left out on one of the surrounding mountains to die of exposure. At the age of 7, healthy boys were taken from their parents and placed in herds, as Plutarch calls them, to be brutally trained and toughened up for military service under the control of sergeant majorist figures called boy herders. Girls were also trained in physical exercise so as to develop their capacity to bear children healthily and also in useful domestic pursuits. It is not necessary to go in further detail here, save to say that existence in Sparta was, as Plutarch remarks, tantamount to living in an armed camp. Everything in Sparta was subordinated to this, which explains why the ancient Spartans were such indomitable and courageous soldiers, feared throughout the Hellenic world and beyond. If in ancient Sparta citizens belonged to the state in common, this is even more dramatically the case in Plato's Republic. The Athenian Plato was in fact strongly influenced by what he knew and liked of Sparta in his picture of the ideal state. Unlike George Orwell in 1984, Plato was not very interested in the proletarians, and what he recommends as far as education and upbringing are concerned is focused on the ruling elites, the guardians, as they're called, of the state and the actual rulers. Now, to avoid the many abuses which Plato sees as arising from inequalities of wealth, often centered on one's family, the guardians in the Republic will have all their possessions in common. Their mode of life will be rigorously egalitarian. They live entirely in common, including in their personal lives. Women will be on the same level as men, and as far as possible, equal in roles. As Plato sees families as giving people private, selfish, and particular concerns and interests, drawing them away from the communistic way of life, there will be no families. Men and women will, of course, have to copulate so as to produce children, but this will be by means of communal orgies to be held at set times, after which the pairing couples will disperse. Children will be brought up in communal pens or creches taken by state officials from the mothers at birth, so that parents and children will not be able to recognize each other as such. What Plato is doing here is to build on those aspects of Spartan life which he finds attractive and push them to the limit. Plato's own attitude to what he calls Kallipolis, the beautiful city, is not altogether clear. Did he really believe it to be beautiful, or was he proposing it as a dreadful warning to utopians? Whatever, most scholars have taken the Republic at face value, and there is no doubt that many subsequent readers have found, and still do find, aspects of it appealing. Its kibbutz-like equality, its armed readiness, its proto-feminism, its egalitarianism, and perhaps most insidiously, its implied critique of the autonomy and privacy, even insularity, of the family. Now, to see why Plato is wrong on this last point particularly, we cannot do better than turn to Plato's own pupil, Aristotle. In his Nicomachean Ethics and his Politics, Aristotle shows us a sense in which the family is both a natural institution and a beneficial one, generating affections, loyalties, and virtues which utopian visionaries hostile to the family either wrongly dismiss or overlook completely. Human beings, as Aristotle tells us, are naturally disposed to form couples, not only as animals do for reproduction, but also for, quote, the various purposes of life, with each partner bringing particular goods to the union and fulfilling different functions. The children of such unions will naturally be loved by their parents as being a part of themselves, while the children will love their parents as having originated from them. Because of the ties of blood, children will start life with a natural affection for their parents and a disposition to obey. In this environment, children will learn habits of virtue, without which any moral or reflective ethical life is impossible. Aristotle strongly and correctly believes that in order to reason well about morality, you must already have dispositions to love and respect the good and be shamed by the bad, dispositions which are best nurtured in the family. Crucial to the question of education is the fact that the bonds linking parents and children mean that parents will know their children and what suits them better than those outside the family. So, he says, private education has an advantage over public. And the ties of blood which exist between parents and children will also extend to brothers, cousins, grandparents, grandchildren, and so on. Thus, the family engenders a small community with links to the past and the future, ideally inculcating loyalty, virtue, and love that would not be possible in a larger, more impersonal, and less naturally related setting. These considerations in the ethics are developed in Aristotle's Politics. If the union of man and woman is natural, as being required for propagation, other needs are fulfilled in the family, as we have seen. But to fulfill the needs and promote the success of single families, villages will be formed, and then, in order to deal with matters of justice, states. In this sense, for Aristotle, the state is natural, and man is naturally a political animal. Aristotle develops this point by saying that there is a sense in which the state is prior to the individual, or indeed the family, who are not fully self-sufficient. In particular, it is only in a state with laws and systems of justice and order beyond personal self-defense and revenge that individuals and families can lead peaceful and productive lives. However, against Plato, that does not mean that property and marriage should be abolished. Ownership produces care and responsibility over what one owns, and also pleasure or enjoyment, including that of exercising generosity. Now, in pitting Aristotle against Plato on the family, and in endorsing Aristotle's position I am not claiming that Aristotle is completely correct on all points, here or elsewhere. Notoriously, in discussing the family, or what he tends to refer to as the household, Aristotle speaks approvingly of the possession of slaves and also about the dominant role of the father. What he says about slavery should be emphatically rejected. However, what he implies about households can be fruitful in suggesting that one positive feature of the immediate family may be the way in which others, not related to the family by blood, may be drawn positively into its orbit, friends and others helping with childcare, school journeys, games and sports, sharing holidays, and the like. Building on this, we can also consider the way in which basic habits of civilized life are engendered unreflectively and quasi-naturally within a family upbringing, such as language, norms of behavior, moral attitudes and feelings. This is not to deny that these habits might not be produced in other settings, but only to insist that the seamless way that they will be produced in a well-functioning family is important. Nor is it to deny that all families are well-functioning. Some may function hardly at all, with the result that their children may reach school age without the most basic dispositions and skills. But this will be by contrast with the vast majority of families which do function well, and points to the need in the sadly deficient families for support and guidance, rather than being an argument against families as such. It also underlies the way that in most families, the beneficial effects of that form of life continue to be produced, in part because parents and grandparents feel instinctively what needs to be done, often despite difficulty and struggle, but with a sense of reward for the unique types of success inherent in family life. As Aristotle points out at length, happiness should be seen as a byproduct of virtuous activities done well, rather than something like pleasure, which we can or should aim at directly. In this way, for many people, living and working at family life is one of the deepest sources of happiness, and not just for parents and children as related to each other, but for other relations such as grandparents, siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles, and the like. Now, in defending and advocating human life, as I am, we do not need to deny that families can be prone to abuses of various sorts. The very intimacy which is a crucial part of good family life can lead to child abuse. It can, but again, this is not the norm and is regarded by most people and in most families as the more heinous, as the desecration of a sacred bond and as exploitation of those who are innocent and defenseless. Families can also be a sense of corruption, as Plato suggests, from the familial possession of property and wealth. But again, we can agree with Aristotle and many other subsequent thinkers that owning property is a bulwark and a benefit. It is a benefit because it enables the possessors to lead their own lives in freedom and security, prey neither to violent seizure nor confiscation by an overmighty state, though for both of these to be prevented, a state with a legal system is necessary, as Aristotle says. In addition, getting and having property inculcates habits of work, responsibility, and foresight, again, virtues integral to family life. So, to draw this discussion of Aristotle and Plato to a conclusion, within a state, the family is prior, naturally and socially, for both biological and political reasons. Where it exists or is allowed to exist, its bonds will be stronger than those of any other institution, as well as in principle affording home, belonging and upbringing of a uniquely beneficial type to its members. The family will not be hostile to the state, but it will, in an important respect, be more cohesive than the state and autonomous of it. It is precisely because of this last point, from which its private and partial interests and loyalties stem, that utopians like Plato, the admirer of Sparta, will tend to be hostile to the family and even to want to abolish it altogether. And it is not just out-and-out utopians who want to minimize the reach and influence of the family. Remarkably, in 1796, In the wake of the American Revolution, Benjamin Rush, one of the original signatories of the Declaration of Independence, said that each youth does not belong to himself, but is a public property in the cause of liberty. Remarkable that Dr. Rush thought that liberty would be served by a regime owing more to Sparta than to what the USA was becoming at the turn of the 19th century. And he was remarkably wrong if he thought that thinking of youths as public property, and hence presumably leaving their family as little or no say in their educational development, would serve the cause of liberty. And to see why this is so, we can do no better than turn to what J.S.Mill, the great 19th century advocate of liberty, has to say on education in his classic On Liberty from 1859. I think this will surprise some of you who don't know this. Mill's discussion of education in On Liberty begins by asking if it is not an almost self-evident axiom that the state should require and compel up to a certain standard of every human being who is born its citizen. Answering in the affirmative, that it is the state's duty, he goes on to say that it is also a sacred duty of parents to give to their offspring, quote, an education fitting him, the child, to perform his part well in life towards himself and others. So how are these two principles to be reconciled? The state has a duty to make sure that children are educated, but yet it's the sacred duty of parents to do this. Mill is clear that no one should bring, and this won't go down very well nowadays, but Mill is clear that no one should bring a child into the world without having some prospect of feeding and educating it. But if these duties are not fulfilled by parents, the state should step in and supply them, both for the good of the child and for the good of society. And this intervention on the part of the state should be effected as far as possible at the expense of the parent. Mill's robustness on parental responsibility may be unfashionable in 2023, though it has something to be said for it. However, his next point is the crucial one, and it's the one which can and should be defended quite independently of whether we agree with Mill on the parent's initial duty. While Mill asserts that it's the duty of the state to enforce universal education, he insists that that is quite different from saying that the state should provide this education. In his own words, the reason for making this distinction is that, quote, a general state education is a mere contrivance for moulding people to be exactly like one another, and as this mould in which it casts them is that which please the predominant power in the government, whether this be a monarch, a priesthood, an aristocracy, or the majority of the existing generation, in proportion as it is efficient and successful, it establishes a despotism over the mind, leading by natural tendency to one over the body. Tough stuff. Every one of Mill's words here is worth pondering. Mill is as passionate and eloquent a defender of liberty as any. The whole argument in On Liberty is that liberty in a society depends on the possibility of a diversity of view, of disagreement and discussion, and it is only through disagreement and discussion that truth will emerge. Even, or perhaps especially in Mill's view, the most widely held and apparently irrefutable opinion should be tested by critical reflection, if only to bring out its true strength and validity. I suspect that Socrates might agree, although Plato, his pupil, would not. As we have seen, Plato wants a unified state, a super Sparta, unified in thought as much as in behavior. But given that no one, not even a Platonic guardian, can have the whole truth on anything, as Socrates would have insisted, and given that dissent or question-free unity of this sort will be achieved only by compulsion, dissent or question-free unity of this sort will be achieved only by compulsion, a state unified in the way Plato wants will indeed be a despotism. These reflections on liberty, both in general and specifically on educational provision, suggest that parental rights in education are not just what would be good from the point of view of the family, but they're also good from the point of view of society as a whole, if that society has liberty as a core good. Against this, it could still be urged that what would be best for children, for all children, is to have the best education possible. And some or even many parents may not understand what this is. Of course, that's the automatic reaction from civil servants and bureaucrats. Parents don't know. As Dewey, not a hero of mine, memorably and somewhat sententiously put it back in 1899, what the best and wisest parent wants for his own child, that must the community want for all its children. Dewey does not, of course, say who he thinks the best and wisest parent might be, though one may have a suspicion as to who it is. And if it were John Dewey, it is not what I would want for my child. It would be the community that imposed whatever it and Dewey wanted on my child and on all other children. So we are back, in effect, with a Millian despotism. It might, though, be said that in a system where parental choice was the ultimate determining factor, there would be schools which taught things which were out of tune with the norm or with what had come to be generally acceptable in a society. Here we have to allow that parental choice should, up to a point, be constrained by law. That is to say, schools which maltreated children physically or which indulged in practices which seriously infringed children's basic rights in other ways would not be permitted and would be closed down by law. As already observed, families can only flourish in societies in which there are legal systems upholding basic rights and administering justice. So one of the conditions of living a reasonable family life is to be in a society in which family members have to accept certain legal constraints, including up to a point on education. Beyond very basic decencies and rights, though, it is not hard to envisage cases where some families and some members of some families hold beliefs which appear to contravene generally held principles or norms of conduct, and wish to have their children educated in conformity with their minority beliefs and principles. Should such schools be permitted to exist? Should the mere fact that schools might be teaching minority religious beliefs or operating on extreme progressive lines, or even on very traditional lines, be closed down by the state? On this question, from the perspective of what is required by liberty, Mill is emphatic. All attempts by the state to bias the conclusions of its citizens on disputed subjects are evil. There could be no more blatant attempt by a state to bias the conclusions of its citizens on disputed subjects than by preventing parents with dissenting but not inhuman views from educating their children as they see fit. Now I'm going to draw some practical conclusions. In order to see what might be involved here and how respecting parental rights might work in different cases, I'll now turn to an article by actually a friend of mine, William Galston, called Value Pluralism and Political Liberalism. And it's relevant to note here that Galston is not only a distinguished American academic, senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, but has also served as presidential advisor to President Clinton and has worked in no fewer than 6 US presidential campaigns. So Bill and I are at one on this point which I'm going to mention. In the article, Galston considers the attitude governments should take to communities such as the Amish, Mormons, and some minority Christian churches when parents in those communities wish to educate their children according to their own principles rather than according to state norms, and who are taken to court as a result. Of course, these cases are difficult because in the cases in question, the states will be using the law to do what they believe to be in the children's interests. Here there is a clear conflict between parental rights and what the legislators and officials deem to be the state's rights, acting paternalistically on behalf of children. The beleaguered communities in question are in general law-abiding and, as Galston notes, often score highly on political engagement and education. And he concludes that respecting value pluralism in liberal societies requires that liberal societies should not, quote, casually interfere with organizations that don't conduct their internal affairs in conformity with broader political norms. Galston argues that there is, as indeed I would, that there is a baseline minimum which everyone in a liberal society must conform to. So no community would be permitted to engage in human sacrifice, for example, unless unrealistically, Galston would deny Jehovah's Witnesses the right to withhold blood transfusions from their children in life-threatening situations. He also concedes that there is room for reasonable disagreement about where that baseline should be drawn, and these questions are often difficult, but, quote, the moral philosophy of pluralism should make us very cautious about expanding the scope of state power in ways that coerce uniformity. In line with his theoretical stance, Galston supports the parental rights of the groups he considers against legal attempts to coerce them and their children into the state schools, or in attempts to make their own schools follow the state norms where these are matters of dispute. Galston points out that in the cases in question, there are conflicts between religious faith, tradition, and authority on the one hand, and what might be called Enlightenment values on the other. He and I would defend the rights of the religious parents in such cases. Unfortunately, and against Galston's caution about expanding state power in these matters, in Britain anyway, the state is increasingly using a combination of law, regulation, and compulsory inspection regimes to force all schools, including independent or private schools, to teach its own, or what may be, majority beliefs. These include beliefs on such matters as sexuality and climate change, and may well soon include beliefs on race and colonialism, with others to come. In each of these cases, present and to come, the position taken up, or maybe to be taken up, by the state are on what Mill rightly calls disputed subjects. In saying this, I am not saying where I stand on any of these matters, nor am I saying that the preponderance of argument may be on one side rather than the other, nor, incidentally, does Galston in the cases he considers. But the question is whether the state has a right to enforce what it takes to be the correct view. However, many schools, state and independent, are currently in thrall to particular ideas about sexuality and race or colonialism, as I've already observed. These views, which include the idea that white people are inherently and apparently irredeemably privileged, and also a raft of doctrines centering around the notion that gender or sex is fluid and that one should not be fixed in the gender one is, quote, assigned at birth rather than born with. It seems that in some, or many cases, pupils who disagree with the orthodoxy being taught are treated roughly in schools, reprimanded, or even ostracized if they have the temerity to express their disagreement. So much for so-called critical thinking in these schools, which no doubt the people suppressing these views would say they're greatly in favor of. But more likely, dissenting pupils will not reveal what they really think. Certainly in many cases, they will be being taught, or indoctrinated more accurately, in ways and directions their parents think is wrong, even reprehensible. Worse still, there are cases where children or adolescents who are uncertain about their sexuality are being given advice and support in schools without their parents being consulted or even informed. It is not hard to envisage cases where pupils, possibly encouraged by teachers enthusiastic for the ideas in question, will denounce their parents privately or publicly for having, quote, the wrong views, or even for, quote, hate crimes. It is not hard to envisage such cases because this is exactly what happened in the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries under communism, to the extent that in the 1930s, Pavel Morozov, a 13-year-old young pioneer, denounced his parents to the authorities. As a result of this, his father was executed, Pavlik was knifed to death by his relations for his pains, and immediately became a national idol, a martyr to the cause, with an opera, could you believe it, and many books produced in his honor. Whether what was celebrated actually happened or not is now somewhat disputed, but what is not disputed is that Morozov was for decades held up as a model for Soviet children to follow. We do not live in the Soviet Union, but there are tendencies within our societies which are not completely dissimilar. We can certainly envisage parents being cautious in expressing their real beliefs to, quote, woke children, indoctrinated in woke attitudes in school, maybe for fear of unpopularity or worse, for being denounced in school by their children, for example. My mum says this. What is in effect a repudiation of parental rights over what their children are being taught in school will at the very least be corrosive to family life. But it may be that the schools themselves have little freedom of maneuver in this area. And I'm now going to tell you about an individual case which I know quite well. An independent school in England has recently lost its head following failure in 2 mandatory inspections for, in effect, not satisfying the inspectors on its attitude to homosexuality, which they described as, just get these words, as a particular biblical interpretation. That was the inspectors. Now, there are 2 inspecting bodies in England, both under state regulation, and all schools have to be inspected by one or other of these 2 bodies. And if they fail 3 inspections, the Secretary of State then has to move in and probably close the school down. So it's a serious matter. So it began by failing this school, which academically was actually a very good school, for having a particular biblical interpretation of homosexuality. So that was the first inspection. The second inspection, the inspectors conceded that the school had actually addressed their concerns from the first inspection. There was now no discrimination against LGBT pupils, which actually the school denied there was, but anyway, the inspectors now said there is no discrimination against LGBT pupils, and various measures have been introduced to cater for their needs. But the school still failed because there were some LGBT pupils who continued to lack, all this is quotations from the reports, by the way, which you can look up on the internet if you're interested, who continued to lack self-esteem or confidence. Failure. What is striking about this case is that there was no mention in either report of the views of parents who were not consulted in either inspection. Suppose the parents actually wanted a or the particular biblical interpretation that was being taught. Actually, they did. But even if they did not, is the implication that a school with such a, quote, biblical view would not be allowed to exist, even if parents wanted such a thing? But providing one does not discriminate against LGBT pupils, and the school did not, according to the second report, disputed as it might be, it is not yet illegal to hold a particular biblical view on such matters. That, though, is the point. The matter is disputed, and not just by fundamentalist Christians. It seems to be exactly the type of case where, as Mill puts it, state attempts to bias the conclusions of its citizens are evil. The head was then sacked. And yet this is just what the state appears to be doing, not by legislation, but by a less than transparent inspectoral mechanism, deciding on what can or cannot be done regarding a disputed matter in an independent school, or do we have to say, quote, independent school? For it seems that now any school teaching in the wrong way and damaging self-esteem on LGBT, etc. matters will be failed by inspection with potentially damaging consequences for its future. And of course, that's one school, but everybody knows that this has happened. So all the other schools will now be concerned about this. The Morozov case of a child denouncing its parents may well seem exaggerated in 21st century Britain. But social services in Britain already have extensive powers to involve themselves in the doings of families, sometimes appropriate and necessary, unfortunately. But overzealous action by social services and the manipulation of children's testimony is not unknown in my country. Although what I'm going to talk about actually is Scotland still, never mind. Notoriously, in 1991, children in Orkney were removed from their parents and one parent imprisoned over what turned out to be entirely baseless suspicions of satanically inspired child abuse. A particularly troubling aspect of this case was the use the authorities made of statements they elicited from some of the children concerned. One lesson that should be learnt from this is surely that extreme care needs to be exercised over the use made of statements about their parents by children, especially when these statements seem to justify action against the parents, and especially when these statements are elicited by over-enthusiastic officials. Morozov may suggest a general lesson, but not the one the Soviet authorities intended. More recently, in an attempt to constrain families even more, in 2014, the Scottish Executive, that's the devolved government of Scotland, proposed a bill in the Scottish Parliament to assign a guardian, their term, outside the family for every child in the country, in Scotland, from birth until the age of 18. The state guardian would have access to all sorts of information about the children and indeed their families, and to have powers to refer cases of concern to a raft of different agencies and authorities. One needs little imagination to conjecture what a guardian might do if, quote, unacceptable views on race or gender were found in a family he or she were guarding, in inverted commas. The proposal eventually failed for various reasons, mainly to do with practicability. But though there was some opposition to it from bodies concerned with parental rights, it was supported, I'm sorry to say, by a number of charities and professional groups, as well as in the Scottish Parliament. To readers of Plato, the title guardian has an ominous ring. And the proposal itself is indicative to current attitudes to parental rights among many politicians and officials who seem to believe that families are problematic in themselves. While in England so far there has been no talk of state guardians poking their noses into the lives of every family, it is ominous that in a recent bill, under the Conservatives of course, in the Westminster Parliament, state education was placed more firmly and comprehensively under direct regulation by the Secretary of State than education than ever before. In that bill, the parental rights to choose a school with a curriculum they, rather than the Secretary of State, favoured is not even considered. The bill has been dropped for the moment, but its spirit may still be alive in Whitehall, even under a Conservative government. It is for this reason that we need not only to remember the balance in the Eastern Bloc between family and state, but also to see why here and now, well, I know we're in Hungary, but I'm talking about in Britain, and parental rights are important, the ways they are currently under attack, and how best to support and defend them. And in this talk, I've attempted to lay out the reasons for strong family rights, particularly in education, as benefiting both members of families and the wider society in which families are allowed to flourish. This may well be timely, given that currently parental rights in education are under threat in a number of areas and places, either intentionally or simply by neglect and default.
You have given us a wealth of philosophical wisdom, a tremendous amount of practical application, and some terrifying examples of the way in which policy is drifting in the modern world and developing along lines which are insidiously despotic, really. And I think that is, we've been very fortunate to have had that lecture. I'm now going to ask Jeremy if he would like to begin the process of debate and argument.
Thanks so much. It's always nice to find out from a very learned lecture, such as the one by Professor O'Hara, that my unreasoned prejudices, in fact, have a strong philosophic backing. So I do thank him for that. I sort of take this at a much more practical level for me. I mean, the first way that I look at this issue is that I'm a father of 5 school-age children right now. And so for my wife and I, this is not an academic exercise. It's a very practical exercise in terms of what we can do. Having said that, and the professor was in sort of laying out these issues, the sort of dichotomy between Athens and Sparta that he sort of laid out so nicely, in some ways is actually even being an interesting kind of development on the right. There's sort of some interesting philosophical tensions between what we might call the traditionalists, particularly Christian traditionalists, and what are the so-called vitalists, led by a guy named Costin Alamariu, who has his doctorate from Yale, but has kind of developed a popular following under a pseudonym, kind of pushing for this sort of more Spartan type of education, which I would agree is sort of the wrong way to go. And then I'd maybe finally add, before I just turn it back for sort of a broader discussion, I kind of think, at least in a U.S. context, and I understand the British context or the Hungarian context may be somewhat different, but the name of the game is really not as a sole thing, but as the primary thing we need, a really robust universal school choice under a kind of broad rubric of what's acceptable. Because I've seen it, and I got involved even in Montana in some of these issues where we testified at some significant abridgments of parental rights before our school board. We were able to make some progress on that, but it was really, I didn't kid myself that was anything other than as soon as we look away, they're going to go do the same thing again. And really the only thing that really changes that, in my view, in a market economy is when I can take my money and my kids somewhere else. And that's not a panacea, because there's other things involved, but I think that is the necessary, if not necessarily the sufficient precondition for really making progress on this issue in a practical sense.
Thank you very much. I'm going to raise a few points to you both, and then I'm going to throw it open to discussion from the floor. The first point I think I'd like to suggest is, and I'm trying to remember if the quote from Mill includes the word diversity, but Mill certainly is warning against having a single system of education. And diversity is, in that sense, the opposite of that, is we want to have. So we really want, do we not, to have several traditions of upbringing, some religious, some presumably the schooling delivered by Bertrand and Dora Russell, which was anti-religious, so to speak, and others. And we want several streams of education in society so we can compare and contrast. So if that's the case, I want to ask ask you to develop the point in which that's not available through the market system if the system of moral regulation doesn't allow it. That's
what's happening under the independent schools. You need to. Sorry, I must. Yeah, sorry. That's absolutely right. So you can have a system of private schools, but if those private schools are regulated by the state to conform to certain attitudes, they're not really independent. You don't have the diversity that you need. By the way, I agree very much with Jeremy that for me the ideal would be a completely independent system of education with different types of school, and parents having, by whatever means, vouchers. Vouchers would unfortunately give the officials scope to interfere. and say you can only spend vouchers in schools we approve of, but maybe by tax credits or something. Give parents the right to choose their schools for their children. And leave the, within, the schools should publish what they do. They should publish their prospectuses. They should publish their exam results. They should maybe even publish their curricula and even lesson plans. So it should be open what they're doing, but then it should be up to the parents to make the choices.
Now, I'm very supportive of that attitude myself, but let me just raise one obvious question, which is the kind of education available in Birmingham, England, in which through the electoral system, Muslim schools were created, which did not, in fact, conform to in a sense, the general attitudes to girls' education in English society. Now, first of all, do we support the right of parents in that case to choose that education? Secondly, if we do in a general sense but think there are limits to it, what are those limits? Because obviously the development in Britain of a large Muslim community, which in some respects is defending the rights of all parents, I'm thinking of sex education, but on the other hand is proposing certain kinds of education which make the rest of society feel uncomfortable. So what are the limits of this kind of thing? Well, I'll ask Jeremy first and then ask...
Sure. Well, and we have these same debates right now in the U.S. context. And, I'd say a couple of things. First, ultimately, I think this is a question of prudential statesmanship. I don't think, and this is what we try to specialize in it at Claremont, where I'm a full-time fellow. It's not that there is a one-size-fits-all sort of thing. It's just you have to, whereas George Well would say, the four most important words in conservatism being up to a point. So there just needs to be a somewhat latitudinarian, but ultimately there are going to be some things that are in and some things that are out. But I do think these sorts of rules that you touched on earlier are really important in that what you had in the U.S. starting in the 1940s was a constitutional revolution in which God was removed from the public square. And I don't even want to say that it was a misinterpretation by the Supreme Court of the Establishment Clause, because I just don't even think that they really cared what the Establishment Clause of the U.S. Constitution said at all. These justices were too smart to not understand what, in fact, had been constitutionally intended. They just decided they didn't care and they knew better. So we're beginning to see in the U.S. the court claw back some of these rights, and for what we really should have, which is for religious schools and other similar schools to be able to participate equally. They shouldn't be prejudiced against in the context of these sorts of competitive processes. So I think at least in the U.S. we're beginning to get some centering on that, but there will be certain points where we may just say that's too much, and I think that's fine.
Yes, well, I did say that cases such as the ones you've just mentioned, but others too. I didn't say these cases were easy, and I also said, I think I said, certainly in the long version, I say that schools must operate under the law. So in the case of girls' education, if Muslim girls are being refused education, that would fall foul of the Equality Act 2010, which may or may not be a good thing, but it would still, the school would still have to, the Equality Act 2010 may or may not be a good thing, but the schools would still have to operate under the law, whatever the law was. That's part of the price of being in a liberal democratic society. And I don't think, as Jeremy has just said, that, secondly, I don't think parental rights are absolute. I've just given a way in which I think they're will be limited. And I think that there can be difficult cases. And then I think it's a question of prudence, judgment, and wisdom, how you handle them. So I don't think and that again is an Aristotelian point, there's no moral syllogism that will allow you in every case to deduce from what you already think what should be done. So you've got to weigh up the balances. But and weigh up the odds on both sides. But I do want to insist that, like Bill Galston does, that we should be very cautious of interfering with parental rights just because we think that the school may be doing something that we don't like. Let me give another example. You mentioned Bertrand Russell, whose school was a disaster, by the way, and he walked away from it. But there is a school, a famous school, and I mentioned this in the longer version of this paper, called Summerhill, that is, from my point of view, a dreadful progressive place where children don't have to go to lessons and blah, 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 all that stuff. And the Secretary of State at one point tried to close it down. And I think that was wrong. I think if parents wanted to send their children there and were paying for it, and it wasn't harming the children in a very obvious way, the Secretary of State had no right to do that. And that would be also because I don't think in education, or indeed in any other matter of that sort of importance, I don't think there's a monopoly of wisdom. I want my children to be, or wanted my children to be educated in a particular way. But I'm not going to say that that is without criticism, and there couldn't be other ways that are also good.
I just quickly add to that. I certainly agree with everything you just said. My friend Mark Krikorian here from the Center for Immigration Studies in the U.S., I think would find this relevant. A lot of this ends up being, or at least some of these hard questions are downstream of immigration policy, in that if we let in people with radically different cultural values en masse to the UK or the US or whatever, then you're going to have a lot of dispute about even the fundamentals, and to the degree to which you stop that and have a more cohesive society that is coming from a more common philosophical and religious background, these sorts of edge cases are going to be much less frequent. And so it's one more reason for me that we should be very assiduously guarding our border.
I'll speak up a bit for Muslims. I think most Muslim parents want their children to be well educated.
And they certainly get to university and move into middle-class occupations.
And they don't like some of the things that are being forced on them. And I agree with them on some of those points.
Yeah. I'm going to raise two more points, and then we'll throw it up on the floor. One is homeschooling. That is the most radical, practical expression of parental rights in education. And indeed, I think in Britain, there was a move in that direction in the reforms introduced by Michael Gove and the Conservative government towards allowing parents, in effect, to create schools with some government subsidy.
That's not homeschooling.
No, I'm sorry, that isn't. That's an era. Well, I'd really like your comment on both, actually.
Well, I mean, I can well see why parents, in certain circumstances, would want to homeschool, and I would support them in those circumstances. In the circumstances I think it would be necessary. So I don't have any principled objection to it, and nor should Mill, who only says that it's a duty of that children should be educated, and that's indeed what the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, before the bit I read to you, it says that children should be educated, but again, it doesn't say how. And if homeschooling can provide a decent education, I do know people who've been homeschooled who seem to me to be perfectly decent, well-educated people. I can't see anything wrong with that. You might say they don't have the social opportunities that other children have. I don't even agree with that. I mean, my son played for a local rugby club and met all sorts of different boys at it, and my daughters rode with pony clubs. There are lots and lots of clubs and other social opportunities for children. So I don't really see that people who say they wouldn't have the social opportunities if they're homeschooled, I think they're wrong, actually.
And the system that the Conservatives introduced, which I describe as, so to speak, as a move in that Sorry, or what about the system of education that the Conservatives introduced, which I described as a move in that direction?
Yes, and that move would have been completely squashed by the Zahawi bill I talked about, at the end of my talk. So don't trust the Conservatives. They wanted to introduce a form of regulation of schools that was completely unprecedented in Britain, because they think that they know how things should be taught and done, and therefore everybody's got to conform to that, which is another attitude of a type of conservatism I don't like.
Actually, I should say that when I was at school, it was a matter of some pride that school would say, if you were in France today, we would know exactly at any time of the day what you were learning, because the regulations of the French Ministry of Education were so precise, yes, and enforced. So, in a sense, there was in British society at that time what I would say was a general attitude of old-fashioned liberalism, of allowing Maoist liberalism, allowing 100 flowers to bloom, 1,000 schools of thought to contend. Why has that gone away?
You're asking me?
Yes.
Well, I'm at a loss to know why it's gone away. These things have happened by in gradual steps. I was against the national curriculum, which was started in 1989. I then later served on the body that was writing it, but I confess to that. And I thought I was doing some good. It was very hard to see the results of this. And then it was completely overturned by the next government, which is why I was against it in the first place.
Yeah, and I'd say the U.S. system is a little bit different. We have a lot of homeschooling at the baseline. COVID made that go up even more. My wife and I run a small group in our church. I think we homeschooled for a year out of circumstance, send our kids to public schools now. But I think virtually all the other parents in our group actually do homeschool their children, and they do not show any signs of being future serial killers or other sorts of sociopaths. Quite to the contrary. I think they seem like really well-adjusted kids. So I'm a big fan of that. And again, obviously there'll be abuses. There needs to be a certain minimal level of monitoring, but at least in the U.S., I feel like we have that balance pretty reasonable right now.
There are abuses in state schools as well.
Of course, and you have to compare and contrast. All the data on U.S. homeschooling, which is a large N sample at this point, and we're talking millions of kids, suggests that by every single measure, the homeschool kids do better. And the only question really that's kind of at issue here is just to what extent you have confounding variables where the socioeconomic status or the interest of the parents may be. But certainly you'd be hard-pressed to look at the data and find an argument against homeschooling on the basis of that data.
Yes, thank you. Now, let's throw open the argument to the floor. I see two people have indicated they wish to be called on. I think we begin with I was going to say begin with a Hungarian point of view question.
Hello, I'm Theo Bash. I have two comments and two questions, very quickly. America, CRT. So the critical race theory that has been infused in American studies, unlawfully without the population knowing. Luckily for us, you can love Trump, hate Trump is irrelevant. His meteoric passage through time, to be artful, brought up that subject. I happen to know personally that somebody was involved with a company belonging in secret to the Education Department of the United States, introducing CRT elements in most of the books that went into the studies, to be studied in school, to push that subject. My own son, I spent $100,000 to put him through New York University, and I got back, forgive me, a woke, progressive Marxist who tries to teach me what is China, after I've been to China since 1980. The other comment that I have is actually the question for the professor. Professor, What is that biblical thing you keep mentioning, please? You kept talking about the biblical expression. You piqued my curiosity.
That was how the that was a phrase taken from the inspectoral report. What they were objecting to was, quote, a particular biblical interpretation of sexuality.
The interpretation.
That's not my phrase, it's their phrase. And I did something else I wrote. I said, I hope to God they know Hebrew and can actually justify what this biblical interpretation is.
But that whole situation is hypocritical. The whole situation is hypocritical if you look about it, without any question.
Yeah.
These inspections, it's ridiculous. You should know about the Hungarian system of the tankerület. I won't get involved in this right now. Just search it. Because in Hungary, the schools, the public schools, are run from above by organizations called tankerület, which are basically similar to the communist system. You can't do shit. You are underneath the teachers. There's nothing they can do. They cannot change the books. They can't do this. The parental rights in education, it's an amazing subject, in my opinion. And I commend you for the work that you're doing. And I don't think we have too much chance of stopping people like the teacher unions in the United States. You have seen the Veritas interviews with them saying, we're coming for your kids. Because the subject of the LGBT, forget the letters. Stay simply with lesbian and gay. Okay? They have rights. But one of the rights that the teachers and the don't have is to infuse the transgender subject on the kids, which is a subject on its own. And that also brings us to parental rights in education. You were saying the school with the biblical thing.
Can we wrap this up with
yes,
a question
okay.
mark? Yeah.
You were saying that the parents did not have the right to know what was happening in school. That's criminal.
Well,
is that true?
Unfortunately. I mean, should I just comment on that? Actually, the Prime Minister has intervened in this, and so has the Secretary of State very belatedly. But schools were saying that with materials they were using on sex education, because these were copyright, can you believe this, they could not show them to the parents.
Wow, bravo.
Yeah, and that's just a fact. I mean, that was what the schools were saying. So parents could not see what their children were being taught.
And the mini rebellion we had in Montana was over critical race theory. And Montana is a conservative state, but where we live is not particularly conservative. It's not ultra woke or ultra liberal, but it's more left than right. And I think the district was surprised by the level of political vehemence that they got from across the political spectrum. And so I think this is a very live issue politically in the U.S.
Yeah, I think I'd like just to make a positive comment about this. Now parents do know much more than they did about this sort of thing. And there is a bit of an upsurge of parental activity. And I think it could be a way of reintroducing or reaffirming, strengthening some conservative values in the country. I mean, in my country, in Britain, now that people know much more than they did, also on, critical race theory and that sort of thing, they know that people are saying Churchill was a criminal. I don't know what they're actually saying that, but that sort of thing is, there's certainly been criticism of Churchill in universities, yes. And the ordinary people are pretty annoyed about this, and there is some sort of, I think, groundswell of opinion against it, which may be a way of reaffirming some basic values in the country. So that could be a good outcome of all this.
But they're not going into domestic terrorism as they are in the US with the FBI, are they?
I think there's. I was going to turn. Sorry.
Just your last comment. I think it was Orwell is the one who said only hope is in the proles. A couple of points. First one is maybe the Wuhan Institute of Virology did us a favor, because we would not be having this discussion if COVID hadn't happened and the schools hadn't been shut down, at least in the United States, and all the parents saw it's like, what the heck are you people teaching our children? So in one sense, this is one of those, supposed Joe and Lai quote about what's your thoughts about the French Revolution? It's too early to tell. Well, maybe in the long run, it's apocryphal, but anyway, maybe in the long run, it's too early to tell whether COVID was a blessing or a curse. But the main point I wanted to make was about the homeschool Islam issue. First of all, as a prudential matter, Jeremy is totally right. Numbers are of the essence. If you don't have a lot of Muslims, it's just not that big a deal. But the issue isn't, Professor, whether Muslim parents want their kids educated well. In the United States, the average level of our Muslim population educationally is extremely high, actually. It's very different from Europe. But the issue is not, did they learn multiplication tables by the 3rd grade? The question is, are they inculcated into our civilization or not? That's really the issue. And the other religious minority groups you were referring to, Amish and what have you, they're quietists who are, sort of subsets of Western civilization. It's not if you have the, Hamas school named after the, arm of the Jew slayer or whatever. And that's just, even if they teach math, phenomenally, they are seceding or not even never joining Western civilization. And that's a problem regardless of how well the kids can read. That's my concern.
So, obviously, I agree with that, and I do think the COVID thing is really interesting. I mean, not just in education, but there are a number of ways in which it's too early to tell whether it was beneficial or not. But certainly, we had an enormous uptick from an already high baseline of homeschoolers, and more people going into private schools because the public schools refused to teach. And while that's reverted a little bit, it's still much, much higher than it was a few years ago. And I think that's also created constituencies to push even more on these issues. And I don't think it's an accident. The most aggressive universal school choices stuff that we've ever seen in the United States is coming in the wake of COVID in a number of states where we for the first time have really had universal school choice bills passed in states. And it'll be interesting to see how that ends up playing out.
Another question. Simon.
Thank you, Professor, for your talk. It was helpful. But it seems to me like one of the main messages of the talk was that this problem is inherently philosophical rather than a policy question. It is a policy question, but philosophy lies underneath all of it. And so that was a very helpful emphasis of the talk from Australia. And my comment / question is this: in Australia, the legislative framework actually is at a high level is quite good in terms of how this works. So in Australia, the main requirement of schools is to teach Australian values, and they list 7 or 8 broad values in the Education Act, which are to do with representative democracy and Australian history, Australian and British history, and so on, which all actually make sense if you look at them. I'm interested to know if you think, in practice, the issue actually is regulation, because what you're describing with the examples in Britain is regulators going in and squeezing schools for particular cases. And it seems to me to be the case that's in Australia, that's the case in Australia as well, that actually they get you with regulation rather than legislation. So it looks to me like it's partly an application of, it's a philosophical question, but the bits in the middle look okay, and then it's the policy application that seem to be a problem. I'm interested to know if you think that's fair and whether there are ways that we can fix this.
Well, one way would be to abolish the current school inspectorate.
Which is a regulation problem.
And set up independent inspectoral bodies that would have to conform to certain criteria, and then the schools could choose which one they wanted. And I think the inspectoral reports should be objective, that is, describing what they saw rather than making judgments. Obviously, if something was completely unacceptable, they should say that. but they shouldn't be imposing their own, and I use this word advisedly, their own opinions on things.
Well, this is the most extreme form of the abuse of devolved legislation, isn't it? In which the practitioners themselves write their own rules. Well, the regulators write rules, yes, which has never been meant to be the role of a regulator. Sure. Anything?
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of what folks on the more enthusiastic elements of the right call the deep state. I mean, it's an administrative state problem, and we don't solve it unless we have the administrative state in check. We don't solve it unless we have these alternative accrediting bodies. And in colleges, you're actually seeing in Governor DeSantis in Florida sort of push some actual beginnings of alternative accreditation models growing up. I think that's also happening to a degree in the primary school, but I know a little bit less about the specifics on that.
Yes. Another question. Was there?
Yeah.
There's a lady at the back.
Hi. I'm from Hungary. I went to school in the UK as well, so I can compare the systems. In the UK, you just go home, you don't have any homework, so you just have sheets of paper. In Hungary, you have a school book, you have exercise books, so parents can actually see what the kids are learning. They can, study with them, so it's slightly different. I think on this gender and LGBT issue, I actually think it's the lobby groups and Stonewall and other pressure groups that should be stopped rather than throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's not about regulation, it's about who is telling the regulatory bodies what should be included in the curriculum, because it's nothing to do with education. So education advisors should be involved, but not gender or human rights or diversity champions. So I think this is the issue, and I think punishing the poor people who can't afford, paid education or private schools is not the right way to do it, because actually the poorest people don't actually agree with any of this, gender identity. They actually don't care. This is a middle class issue, and this is pushed on the education system by these lobby groups who are primarily governed by neoliberal middle class, and so this is not the right way to solve it by these education system changes. Actually, there's Montessori schools and Steiner schools, so there's a number of different schools where people can go outside of the normal system. And there's also working union, the NAHT and the National Union of Education. They should be standing up, and they should be allowed to actually give voices to teachers so they can actually oppose this, because in a lot of cases they get fired and no one stands up for them.
Well, yes, over.
Yeah, I mean, I one of the things I discovered, wasn't very difficult to discover, but when I was on these government committees, was that because the civil servants thought maybe there was a statutory duty to consult on just about everything, that meant that all the lobby groups would then jump in and appear before the committees or send in what they thought should be done. And then we had, on the committees, had to take all this into account. And if we were strong, which I was, I mean, I wasn't the head of it, but, if you could just say, well, forget it. But normally, the lobby groups would then have, because they would be taken into account, or what they were saying would be taken into account in the final proposals or whatever it was, they'd have far more influence than they would if it was done in a more democratic or parliamentary way.
Yeah, I actually, your point is very well taken, that I'm not such a John Stuart Mill liberal on these issues that I just think, the way to do this is we just throw open the discussion to everybody and the best ideas win, or whatever it is. And certainly with you talk about those pressure groups, it's not that I don't think that there might be a default way to approach transgenderism or just LGBT issues generally. I would just like to see a very different one than what's being taught currently as the default. So I'm not shying away from the fact that we should have certain opinions, but I think at the very least, I'm going to have that discussion / argument with somebody else who's going to feel very differently. And at the very least, we ought to kind of move to a place of studied neutrality in terms of that different schools should be able to have different approaches to these issues, and at least we can leave it there. But I don't think we should check our own personal moral values at the door when we have these discussions.
No. There is obviously an element a pressure group here, which is really very important, and that, of course, is the education bureaucracy itself, the so-called blob. Now, you dealt obviously with certain aspects of that, but can I just ask you both, really, to stand back a little and give us a general account of what the education bureaucracy, the blob itself, which I think we have to say now includes the leadership of the teachers' unions, maybe always did. And what is the general social philosophy that is shaping their interventions, their regulations, and their treatment of individual schools, particularly in the area of religion, where it does seem religion has to fight to keep the place it used to have in the British education system, the American, and I would guess the Hungarian one as well.
Well, I mean, I think most of the people who are, quote, experts on education are basically followers of Dewey and Rousseau. They believe in child-centered education. They believe in an egalitarian society. You know, they have all the standard attitudes of Guardian readers, and probably they may be quite sincere, but they, well, I mean, I was accused of promoting the curriculum of the dead, because this was 30 years ago, because, you know, I wrote articles about saying that that there should be an initiation into Greek tragedy and Shakespeare, and even, well, it's now come to science as well. So these people are people who, they're mostly mediocrities, who've made their way, I mean, I'm talking about the education departments and trainers, who've made their way through the teaching profession and moved into these higher positions, but with all these attitudes. And I mean, they're probably quite sincere, but you know, they will say that all children are creative, they should find things out for themselves. You know, it's wrong to impose values on them, all that sort of thing. I think it's because of their background, and probably because they got promoted because they've said these things.
Yeah, and I'd say, I mean, calling them mediocrities is way too generous in my view. I mean, they're really awful. The education bureaucracy, what goes on in these education schools in the United States, which are largely a requirement to teach in a government school, a public school, i.e. in the United States, it's just appalling. It's kind of like public health, where you have no idea how bad it is until you really begin to look at the people who are teaching and what the curriculum is, because you'd sort of think it's a harmless thing, and in fact, it's largely a very radical thing that does not serve the purposes that it intends to serve at all. And I think until we totally smash those monopolies, which are just as much a monopoly as the teachers' union, it's going to be very hard to make any real progress, because there is nothing about going to a school of education that turns you into a better teacher of anything that we should care about in any dimension. And we would open up the market a lot if we gave more.
Again, gentlemen at the back.
That actually led to another idea. You know, in politics, they say personnel is policy. And it seems that parallel to efforts to promote school choice, make homeschooling easier, wouldn't it be to streamline or eliminate or whatever, change the accreditation system for teachers to basically turn, you know, to take away the monopoly these schools of education have. In other words, schools of education delenda est basically should be the goal. And so that if you're a smart person who was a CPA and now wants to go into teaching, you can take a test that shows you know math, and then you can become a math teacher.
Yeah, I mean, this is there would if we shut down every single school of education in the country, it would be nothing but a salutary good to American education, which is not to say that every single thing is useless, but on a net basis, it's just so negative.
Anything to add to that?
Well, not really, except that the whole, I mean, people don't know, I mean, the people themselves don't know that they are actually, most people in college, departments of education, I'm not talking about in universities, I'm talking about in the so-called departments of education, where teachers are trained, and to teach in a state school in Britain with some qualifications, you have to be accredited by these departments, have to get a qualification for these departments. Most of these people are inured in Dewey-esque attitudes, but they don't know that because they have never read Dewey, probably. But I think there was a complete takeover from the Columbia School of Education obviously in Columbia. That spread all over America. These attitudes of Dewey about discovery learning, not teaching useless knowledge, etc., etc. Dewey said all these things very forcefully. He also said other things. So if I criticize Dewey, I'm then told, oh no, he doesn't say that, he says something else. And that is true. But the things that people have focused on in Dewey is the child-centered discovery learning aspect, where the teacher is not a teacher, he's merely a facilitator of group activities.
Yeah, I mean, I long for the days that we would just be worrying about Dewey. I mean, they're being taught to trans my kids, right? I mean, that's part of the issue. I mean, the Dewey stuff is serious. That's been a problem for 50 years, 75 years
But it's, yes,
in American education. But they're actually just at this point, we've gone well beyond that, at least in the States, and it's just pure left-wing political indoctrination on any number of issue areas that you are required to sign up for if you want to get your teaching license.
But Dewey, he was a multiculturalist and an egalitarian.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the roots of his mischief are virtually infinite.
Yeah. So, I mean, I said, all right, but I'm not going to disagree with you.
Yeah.
Right, another question? Yes.
Sorry. As a total outsider, for about 30 years, I go regularly to England. And what I notice there is a tragic decay of the average intellectual level of people whom you meet in banks, in certain institutions. They can't count in banks, only with the counting machine and so on. We went in summer to Chartwell. Near Chartwell, the next village in Chartwell, we lost our way because we had no satellite. We wanted to ask, where is Churchill's house? We stopped at the main square. There was a young man fiddling with his car, a local. We asked where it is. He asked, who is Churchill? Then we went to the post office. I don't exaggerate. It was really that in England in mid-August. We went to the post office. In the post office, there was a young man again, and we asked the same question, where is Churchill's house? He didn't know again who was Churchill. They lived 5 miles away from Chartwell, Then from the back, the father came out and, oh, yes, he knows who was, of course, our hero. And he gave us instruction how to get there. But this is only a small example. I thought about it, that who are teaching history in England? In the last 20 years, what kind of history do they teach, And who want to become a teacher in England? How much do they earn? Is there any contra selection? Who can become a teacher? What are the curriculums? Who is responsible for a minimal national curriculum in the primary schools even? And then it couldn't happen such a thing, So that's why I want to know, how is the profession looking? Who were in the last 30, 40 years who wanted to be a teacher? maybe with enthusiasm, where did they study, and how do these trade unions develop who protect their interests? That they don't want to teach facts, only methods. These are my questions.
Let me take that in reverse order this time and ask Jeremy first.
Yeah, I mean, we have the equivalent problem in the US of people just not knowing the most basic things. And one of the things you'll see people do on Twitter sometimes is kind of amusing is they'll post like, here was the exam to get into Harvard in 1896, or even like the exam to get into a high school. And it would be so much more than anybody would know today. And I mean, part of that is right. There's more things that have happened, but most of it is just that we're not serious about teaching. There's no accountability. The unions, I mean, these teachers effectively in the United States have tenure after 2-3 years, which means they can't be fired and they should really never have tenure at all. And they're frequently absent, I've observed in my own kids' schools. So there's just no accountability within the system. You're not getting the brightest people because there's not a lot of incentive. It's not like if you're just the most amazing teacher that you're going to get paid way better than a teacher who's really, really bad. So the whole system is just completely broken, and that's why I kind of do come down on the issue of choice as being so important, because I think it does. Not everybody in these schools is bad. Not every teacher is bad. I mean, there are some really good people there, but they're in such a terrible system that they have no incentive to really give us their best. And if you get a good one, it's just a lucky accident. I mean, that's sort of where you are at this point.
Yeah, I mean, there are good schools, both in state and independent sector. But there are too many teachers or too many people qualified to be teachers who don't know enough. And that's partly because of the ideology that is being promulgated in the departments and colleges of education. Because you don't need to teach knowledge. You only need to teach how to learn. You don't need to teach facts because they can look facts up. That, of course, overlooks the fact that you can't look a fact up unless you already know quite a lot. And I think this is tragic, and it's a disaster. The national curriculum was supposed to, when it was introduced in 1989 and since been revised a number of times, it was supposed to remedy this, but it hasn't really remedied it, partly, I think, because the inspectors aren't interested in it, but also because the teachers themselves don't know enough, so because they themselves have not been properly educated. I will just end with an anecdote that my wife was teaching ballet in a professional ballet school, and she was lecturing on the history of ballet, and she twisted my arm to come and talk at this to this class on the Baroque, which I was delighted to do, because ballet, as you know, started in the Baroque era with the Medici in France, and then in France, Catherine de Medici brought it from Italy, and then Louis XIV codified it. So ballet started in France. So that's why we were talking about the Baroque. And I thought I'd make a joke to start with. I said, and this is going to be my last remark, John. I said, I thought this was quite funny actually. I said that the Baroque art was the artistic wing of the Counter-Reformation. And I then thought, oh dear, they might not know what the Counter-Reformation was. These were all 17 and 18-year-old pupils, very nice pupils. They didn't know what the Reformation was.
I think that's a good point at which to end. I'll just first of all, I would like to thank our two speakers very warmly for their performance and elucidating so many interesting aspects of the crisis of education, which of course is therefore the crisis of our civilization, as we are seeing now played out in the streets. But there's an element in this which I think is really worth adding to it, although it's implicit in everything you have both said. And it's not actually drawn from the field of education exactly, but from the related one of social and family welfare. There was a bureaucrat in Washington from HHS giving evidence to a Senate committee on which Senator Phil Gramm, the then Senator for Texas, was asking questions of the bureaucrats. And one of them said in the course of it, "Senator Gramm, I love your children as much as you do." And Gramm replied, "Oh, really? What are their names?" and in a way, the people who are making all these decisions, they don't know the people they're dealing with, and they can't know the children they're dealing with because there are so many children in the United States and in Britain and even in Hungary where there are different communities. And unless there is social account is taken of this basic social, geographical, personal fact, we're always going to be in really serious trouble. I think all of that emerged from both of your from initial very powerful lecture, Anthony, and from the conversation between the two of you. Thank you very much indeed.